I've gotten some questions lately about what I mean when I talk about the collective shadow. So, when I talk about the collective shadow, let's first understand shadow. So, shadow, a good definition for shadow is anything we hide, repress, and deny or fail to see or know about ourselves, right? It's the unlived life, it's the hidden part of our personality, it's what we kind of sectioned off or exiled from ourselves in order to meet the needs, expectations, and demands, especially in the first half of life as we're forming our sense of identity. Our shadow becomes the repository of everything that is not our identity, our conscious identity, at least. And it ultimately is a part of us. And in the second half of life is about learning to engage and integrate those parts. So the collective shadow is that, but on a sociological collective scale, right? So the collective shadow can have many different things in it. And I mentioned in my last podcast with Kevin Martin on sexuality, non-monogamy, and shadow work that if you've been raised in Western culture, you've likely been impacted by Christianity at some level, even if you've never been to church, which is probably unlikely, especially if you're listening to this video or recording. You likely have been impacted by Christianity. And within that collective, there are certain identities that are acceptable and certain identities that are not acceptable. So we're going to spend some time kind of looking at the collective shadow, specifically within Christianity. So this will be one video of several, and we'll just explore this together. So this quote from David Steindl-Rast says, "In its enthusiasm for the divine light, Christian theology has not always done justice to the divine darkness. Abstract speculation can create an image of God that is foreign to the human heart, a God that is totally purged of anything that we call dark. Then we try to live up to the standards of a God that is purely light, and we can't handle the darkness within. And because we cannot handle it, we suppress it." So this quote is jam-packed with so much information, right? So I'm going to unpack it a bit. So, in its enthusiasm for the divine light, Christianity kind of took on the image of a lot of sun god worship, right? Where you had societies that had a pantheon of gods and goddesses. But because of its very monotheistic perspective, you have a religion that said, okay, there's only one God, and that one God is purely light. We even have Bible verses that allude to this, right? Like, God is light, and in him there is no darkness. God extinguishes the darkness. That is one way of talking about one divine embodiment, right? Throughout history, we would say, yeah, Zeus would be an example of the divine light. But you've got the underworld as well, right? That live in this sort of tension at odds, but also simply, we could say, opposites that exist that we at least acknowledge as valuable. So, in its enthusiasm for the divine light, Christianity has not always done justice to the divine darkness. The divine darkness, this is what we might say is that which is beyond us, that we don't have control over, that is outside of our ego identity, that impacts us, oftentimes from a negative perspective. We don't know what to do with that. In Christianity, we have to say that must be Satan, that must be evil. There's evil intent. The problem is that the human psyche isn't wired this way, and we see this come to fruition when when some calamity happens. Currently, the fires in Southern California right now, 2025. There's so much rhetoric in the Christian evangelical world about how this is somehow God's judgment. This is somehow God's way of correcting his people, or people that could be his people but aren't his people. It's very confusing. And I made the point in my last podcast that, okay, well, the reality is the acts and the voice of this divine light God and the acts and the voice of the divine evil or Satan seem awfully similar, right? Like, how are we supposed to tease that out? So if we settle on a one-sided divine light, then the opposite is like nothing. It is confusing. And ultimately, you can see psychologically, we try to form it all back into one. We try to say, okay, well, like maybe God made this happen or allowed this to happen in order to do something good, right? So the bad has to mean something good. We really have to stand on our head to try to shoehorn divine darkness or darkness that is beyond our comprehension, badness, what we consider to be harmful. We really have to work hard to shoehorn that back into this divine light image, right? This God that, has nothing but plans for us to prosper and to have goodness and experience love and peace and happiness. It just doesn't work. So it gives no explanation for what like we can do, how we should live. And in order to align with that God, this is what David Steindl-Rast is saying. Abstract speculation can create an image of God that is foreign to the human heart. In other words, the image of God does not align with our experience. So when our experience is bad, what are we supposed to do with a God that is all good? That means that all good God must be allowing pure badness to happen to us in order to show us pure goodness. But ultimately, how that plays itself out is we end up abandoning our own experience. We abandon our own heart, our own sense of knowing, our own intuition in order to align with this abstract, one-sided divine light. And that just pulls us further and further and further away from ourselves. That God is, totally purged of anything that we could call dark. And then that just becomes very subjective too. So the idea that God is pure light, that God is static, that the divine is this kind of locatable entity or deity that isn't moving and shaping every ounce of our life at all times. It's just not how we experience the divine. But here's the real meat of what I'm trying to say. When we wrap our lives around this abstract God image, then we try to live up to that standard. Right? This is what Steindl-Rast is saying. We try to live up to the standards of a God that is purely light and purged of all darkness. And so then we mirror that. We try to be formed in that image, actually. This is what's encouraged in a lot of Christian evangelical spaces is you're being formed into the image of this divine light. And by doing that, you do have to suppress the darkness. You push it away, you ignore it, as Connie Zweig talks about in her book, you bypass it. There's a spiritual bypassing. Oh, it's not bad. It's actually good. My experience is that this is shitty, that this is very painful, if not traumatizing and abusive, but I'm going to bypass all of that experience in order to align with a God image that's actually doing it all for my good. And there's a certain level of like, okay, I can get behind the idea that there is this long road, this bent towards justice, or we could say fairness and wholeness. I can get behind that so that what happens that is bad is ultimately moving something else. There's something bigger, something more grand. But the problem is within Christianity is that it doesn't actually have that sort of perspective. It doesn't have a perspective that this is somehow moving me towards wholeness. It has the perspective that it's moving me towards rightness or accuracy or perfection, which are all, again, one-sided. They're not images of wholeness, but images of purity. And then because we then suppress and we do that in ourselves, guess what? Anything we suppress in ourselves, anything that is in our shadow, especially the negative shadow, right? The shadow qualities that we do not want to be associated with because they are socially unacceptable. They will be met with rejection, etc. When those things are in our shadow, we will then shadow them in other people. We will then reject them in other people. We will remove ourselves from people who embody that, right? And this is how Christianity, particularly today, has removed itself from the poor, has removed itself from LGBTQ individuals, has removed itself from any sort of like semblance of care and concern for what Jesus would call the least of these. Anyone that is mentioned there is essentially kind of this outcast because they really embody the collective shadow within Christianity. So here's the takeaway. Here's maybe the action step. I want you to take some time to maybe journal out your image of the divine, right? Where have you steered towards this kind of one-sided divine light, or this one-sided image of God or the divine that is springtime and summertime versus the fall and the winter? The reverse is also a possibility. Perhaps you've acknowledged this already, and your image of God has shifted to the other side, where God is simply the God of the winter and the fall and the depths and the darkness. And there's no levity and there's no enjoyment. There's no sense that you can just experience pleasure without constantly experiencing suffering. See, it's not either or. It's both and. And if you find yourself in either or, that's okay. It's actually just an invitation to consider the opposite.